Good afternoon, and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Rachael Taylor, journalist and co-founder of the Jewellery Cut. We're here to revisit the topic of trends. Back in January, Rachael was part of a panel who explored what we expected to see happening in 2020. The one trend that panel didn't predict was the pandemic that has really changed all of our lives over the last few months. And we're here to revisit what they identified as those trends and consider what going forward might be different, what might be the same. On that January evening, the panel identified that the trend was the ascendancy of craft, a desire for the bespoke and customizable and one-off pieces of jewellery, and not necessarily from big brands, more likely not. Also for experiential opportunities, which we have all been lacking, and also a demand for ethically sourced material and sustainable production processes. Storytelling, and finally the need to hold jewellery before buying it, which holding things before we buy them is something we've definitely been lacking the opportunity to do recently, so I'm looking forward to exploring that. It's been a really challenging time since then for small businesses, designer makers and big brands alike, and more has changed in that retail environment than we can really begin to imagine. So it's great to be able to reconsider where we are at, look to the future, what will those trends be, and also what is happening now. So welcome, Rachael. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So to start with, I wanted to ask, what do you think is the most dominant jewellery consumer trend that we've seen through this lockdown period?
As you were saying, during that talk, there's no way we could have predicted what was going to happen just a few weeks after we did that talk, which is quite amazing to think about. But I actually think a lot of the things that we spoke about that evening have remained true, especially that idea of elevating the craftsperson. I think during lockdown there's been a real focus, not just within jewellery or luxury, but in general consumer habits of shopping that little bit more locally. So I mean, whether that's for, I don't know, sort of shielding reasons that you maybe just want to go to your local shop as opposed to going to a big supermarket. I think there's been a real drive for people to support local businesses in terms of perhaps a butcher or a baker who's maybe in your neighbourhood that you want to support. And I think that really comes through with jewellery as well. I think actually there's been a real drive to support smaller designer makers, as we suggested might happen in the talk. And the ones that I've spoken to, actually, there's been a lot of kind of smaller designers who've done quite well during the pandemic and certainly done better than they expected to. And I think that's been fueled by a desire to buy products from smaller brands and support those smaller businesses. And on the other side, there's obviously the larger brands have maybe been hit a lot harder by the pandemic in terms of they have huge global networks that have been felled by the virus. They also might work with larger factories which have had to stop production, whereas if you're a designer maker, craftsperson, you know, you can effectively shift your workplace from, say, the Goldsmiths Centre to your kitchen table and actually keep going. And I think that's given a real edge to a lot of craftspeople.
And so with that in mind, what do you think people are buying? Are they buying the same types of things, albeit from perhaps from designer makers rather than from a brand, or are they buying different types of things? Are they spending the same amounts of money?
I think this has been really interesting. I've spoken to lots of people, and actually what I've heard is there's been a real shift from silver to gold. So people who would have bought silver are now buying gold, especially when it comes to gifting. Because if you're not going to the restaurant, you're not going away for the weekend, you're not going out to the pub, you know, there's all this extra money that would have been spent on top of the gift beforehand that isn't now. So actually people want to invest that little bit more money in jewellery. And I think that's translated to more precious pieces. So I think the actual average spend has been going up. In terms of what they've been buying, I mean, obviously a bit of an unexpected one was the whole Connell's chain thing from normal people, which just absolutely exploded. And that was from the men's jewellery market as well. So those kind of really thin silver chains. I spoke to some sort of manufacturers who just, that literally, they didn't know anything about it. They just suddenly started getting all these orders in for these chains and had no idea what it was. So I think that's been sort of quite a very specific trend. Another interesting thing has been make your own jewellery kits. There has been a real rise. I mean, right from kind of really luxe brands like Carolina Bucci, who's doing, you know, it's £2,000 for one of these kits to kind of make your own beads with sort of, you know, gold elements and things like that, to more affordable kits as well. It's almost that people want to kind of get involved in the making, and also obviously we're all looking, you know, beyond sourdough and jigsaws for different things to do, and I feel like I've seen a lot of jewelry making kits popping up. Yeah, and I think aside from that, just a general trend has really been for sentimental jewelry. So people want to express sort of their feelings at this time and really buy gifts that matter.
That's really interesting. I certainly hadn't thought about it in that way, that money that you might, if you do have disposable income, you might spend in other ways on other treats you can put into the buying something a bit more special. In terms of sort of styles, the men's jewelry thing is really, really interesting, that more men are buying jewelry. If for women, are there particular, other than the gold, are there particular things? I mean, there's obviously, I've seen a lot of rainbow jewelry, which seems obvious in terms of there are rainbows everywhere, not just in jewelry. But I just wondered whether you had noticed any particular sort of designs and you know, in the design side of the jewelry that has seen a prevalence during this time.
Yeah, I think the whole rainbow colourful trend, I mean, obviously we've had rainbows to support the NHS, and obviously rainbow's got its connections to the LGBTQ community as well. And I think it's just that people are looking for joy just now, and I think that colour really sort of resonates. So there's been a lot of that, but also even taking that to the next level is this quite childish, playful jewelry. So there's been a lot of kind of like plastic beads to kind of go away from the precious, and really sort of stuff that looks like, you know, the kind of jewelry that you would have had as a kid, and either completely replicated as it was using, say, like plastic beads, or kind of, you know, with more sort of luxe elements. That's been really interesting. And I just feel that maybe in these times, you know, people want to revert to a little bit of safety and a little bit of nostalgic times when things weren't quite so serious. And then obviously we have the whole Zoom earring phenomenon with sales of, you know, statement earrings. I'm totally guilty of this right now, I realise, as I'm saying it. But yeah, there's been a real thing, you know, where people just when they have to do so many video conferences or say record interviews, there's been a real spike in sale of statement earrings as people need to just kind of like quickly dress up at home for these calls.
Yes, that's interesting. I certainly am a natural brooch wearer, and the brooch doesn't resonate very well over Zoom. You have to adjust to be on the screen and
moving up.
Exactly, and up on your shoulder, which some people carry off really well. Not got to that stage. And so in terms of the trend around sustainability and ethically sourced materials and jewellery of that type, I mean, in certain ways I feel that a lot has reverted in terms of our wider lives around being sustainable. So we're disposing of masks and cups and all the things that we were being very careful about. Have you seen that sort of growth in a demand for sustainable product has been carried through this period, or do you think that has fallen away in favour of the playfulness or the desire to buy something maybe a bit more sentimental and traditional?
I completely agree with you, actually. I feel like the conversation around ethical jewellery has got a lot quieter during lockdown. And also I know at the start of lockdown, ethical or jewelers who work ethically had real problems getting hold of the actual raw materials. So in terms of like fair trade gold or certain, you know, if they have very stringent sort of narrow policies on how they source, that suddenly became very difficult at a time when everybody was finding it difficult to get any kind of materials. So that, I mean, there's a designer called Arabelle Labroussan who has Labroussan Studios, and she just shut down for a few weeks because she just couldn't get the materials that she wanted, and she didn't feel that she could compromise the way that she works, so she sort of held off for a while, which I think access has improved. But I just feel people's concerns have been a lot closer to home. So when with coronavirus, with people kind of dying, you know, in your local communities, and that really being a focus, I feel like that kind of distant idea of, you know, how are things being made overseas. I think everyone's attention has just shifted. In a way though, I hope it will actually have a longer term good effect, because I feel like during this we've all learned to be better humans. So we've learned to give each other space, we've learned to, or we've got used to shopping from brands who have donate to health charities, who are doing good things in the community. And I feel like there's been a lot of support for businesses that do that. So what I'm hoping is that once everyone feels like everything's a little bit more under control, and start to think about ethical jewelry again, actually you've kind of got used to shopping in more of a socially conscious way. So will that then continue on as we kind of get back to thinking about kind of bigger picture ethics?
Yes, I mean that would be a great outcome, wouldn't it? That community mindedness translates to the sort of worldwide community, so that ground is not lost in terms of ethical making. So thinking about the consumer experience, we spoke a lot in January about the experiential nature, and I know that certainly on the panel you were particularly an advocate for the fact that people, in the case of jewellery, really need to hold it, or it's beneficial to hold it before they buy it. And I just wonder, in that kind of different way of shopping, the difference you think that's going to make going forward to how we consume, and whether that still holds true really, or we've become less in need of the touch before we decide that that's for us.
I think if this has shown us anything, it's that we don't need to touch before we buy, because people are still buying jewellery even though they're not touching it before. I think the question is, will we want to? I still hold firm to the belief that actually people do want to touch and feel jewellery before they buy. I mean, I've got jewellery in lockdown, but it's been pieces that I've seen before. And I think that kind of ties into the whole considered purchase thing. Whereas, I'd seen them before, touched them, but in lockdown, I think when everyone's got more time to think, I'm like, oh yeah, like that's actually what I really want. So, but in terms of that experiential side of it, I think there's going to be a real appetite as soon as we get out of this phase of our lives, to actually get back to those experiences. And I think if you look at the brands that have done really well during this time, it's the ones who have managed to translate a bit of that experience online. And I mean, you can never obviously have the full thing, but it's kind of what we spoke about before, that sort of opening up of your life or your workshop or your circumstance, and bringing people in. That in itself is an experience. So it's just about different ways of doing that. And I think there's been lots of innovative services during lockdown, such as I think Tomfoolery, a shop in North London. They were sort of doing a special service where if you saw a jewel that you liked on the website, they would go and then try it on for you and sort of film it for you and kind of bring you in that way. So it's different type of experience, and I think it's definitely we don't need to touch, but I still think that experiences are what we sort of, with jewelry, you want to touch it and you want to have that experience. And yeah, I think we still need that.
Yeah. And how do you think that designer makers and the smaller brands need to keep adapting to sort of stay solvent and relevant and effective in this time? Do you feel that, given what you said, the picture is perhaps not as dire as we might think? People are still buying jewelry, and that's brilliant, and the fact that some smaller brands have done better than expected. But going forward, do you think that there are ways in which they need to sort of continue staying relevant within this time as we come out of lockdown and restrictions are reduced?
I think the number one thing is, I think the real great divide of the pandemic for jewelers has been digital. The ones who were already set up to trade well, or at least promote themselves well online, did okay, and there's been a lot of scrabbling around from other people who maybe didn't have a proper website set up, or weren't using social media as they should do. There's been a real kind of scrabble to fix that. And I think when we open back up, I don't actually think that's going to change, because as we sort of said, people have kind of built up these relationships digitally. And I just think when we talk about the idea of a second wave, or maybe just a change in shopping habits, I feel like people really need to invest in that online presence and not just kind of hunker down and wait for things to get better. And I think the other thing that's really been tested during this time is tone of voice. I think with coronavirus and also Black Lives Matter, I think it's been a real period of uncertainty for people who produce and sell luxury items that, you know, aren't essentials. You know, how do they fit into that landscape? Do they comment on these things? Do they not comment on these things? And again, I think the jewelers who've done well are the ones who've engaged with, you know, both those debates sort of head on and got involved. I think the ones that maybe have sort of skirted around the sides and not really know what to do, they suddenly feel very outdated. And I think it's been a bit of a crash course, to be honest, but those sort of lessons and tone of voice, you could apply those to lots of different things in the future. So I think that's something that jewelers should also be thinking about.
So it's a kind of continued adaptation into that digital world, and to embrace that way alongside developing your business in terms of looking for the experiential bits as well. I think it's interesting. Yeah. It's a continued balancing act.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's really lovely to catch up with you this afternoon and get your updated trends thoughts. Did you have any final things you wanted to share this afternoon, or I hope we've covered everything that you hope to talk about?
Yeah, no, I think it's been good. I think I would just, my other advice to people is just to be positive. I think there's a real need for positivity at the moment, and I think if you kind of put that into the world, hopefully you'll get it back as well.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, in the absence of being able to smile openly behind our masks, you can smile in other ways, can't we, and be really positive. And jewellery is definitely one way to do that. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been fabulous having you online with the Goldsmiths Centre this afternoon. And thank you so much for your time.